I've spent 23 years with the Bureau chasing ghosts, not the supernatural kind, but the human ones that slip through cracks in time and memory. Cold cases were my specialty, the forgotten files that gathered dust while families waited for answers that might never come. I learned to read absence like a language, to find meaning in what wasn't there, to construct truth from fragments and shadows. But nothing in my training, nothing in all those years of walking through the ruins of unsolved mysteries, prepared me for the call that came on an October morning when fog hung so thick over the Potomac it seemed the world itself was dissolving. The voice on the other end was careful, measured, using words that felt rehearsed, words like extraordinary discovery and unprecedented biological find and immediate federal priority. They didn't say what they'd found. They didn't have to. I could hear it in the silence between their sentences, in the way they avoided direct answers, in the tremor beneath their professional calm. Something in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest had shattered every assumption we hold about the natural world, and they needed someone who understood how to keep secrets, how to sit across from the impossible and ask it questions. They needed me because I knew how to listen to what shouldn't exist. The facility wasn't on any map I could find. They flew me to a regional airport where unmarked vehicles waited with engines running and windows tinted black against the pale morning light. We drove for hours through forests so old and dense they seemed to swallow sound itself, cathedral groves of cedar and Douglas fir that towered like the pillars of some ancient temple. The deeper we went, the more the modern world fell away, replaced by something primal and watchful. I felt it pressing against the windows, not hostility exactly, but awareness, as if the forest knew we were trespassing on ground where our kind had long ago ceased to be welcome. The compound appeared suddenly, breaking through the tree line like a concrete wound in the green flesh of wilderness. Razor wire caught the filtered sunlight, guard towers rose against the mountain backdrop, men with automatic rifles and eyes that wouldn't meet mine checked credentials at 3 separate checkpoints. No one spoke except to give directions. No one explained. The silence had weight, texture, the density of a secret so massive it had its own gravity. I'd investigated black sites before, places where uncomfortable truths were buried under layers of classification and denial. But this felt different. This felt like fear. They led me through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and something else underneath, something organic and wild that made my instincts scream to turn back. Dr. Chen met me outside the observation wing, a woman with the hollowed eyes of someone who hadn't slept properly in days, whose hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the protocols. She spoke in technical terms about containment and biological specimens and research parameters, but her voice kept breaking at the edges. When I asked what exactly I was about to see, she just shook her head and said I needed to experience it without preconceptions, that words would only diminish the reality. She handed me a tablet displaying symbols, crude drawings that seemed part pictogram, part ancient script, and explained that communication was possible, limited but genuine. The thing in the reinforced chamber beyond the steel door understood. It remembered. It had been waiting, she said, and the way she spoke that last part made my skin crawl. Not waiting to be captured, waiting for someone to finally listen. She pressed her palm against the biometric lock, and the heavy door began to open with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like the world taking a deep breath before plunging underwater. The room beyond was vast and clinical, built like a bunker within a bunker, walls reinforced with steel and concrete, thick enough to contain anything, or so they hoped. Banks of cameras lined the ceiling. One-way glass panels reflected my own pale face back at me, distorted and strange, a man about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. And there, in the center of the space beneath industrial lights that cast no shadows, secured by restraints that looked simultaneously medieval and cutting-edge, sat something that rewrote evolution. 8 feet of muscle and fur and impossible existence, shoulders broad, as a man is tall, hands that could crush bone, but rested gently against the metal table. But it was the eyes that stopped my breath, deep and dark, and filled with an intelligence that felt older than anything I'd ever encountered. Eyes that held memory and sorrow and something like recognition, in that first moment of contact, when its gaze locked onto mine and held. I understood with terrible clarity that I wasn't here to interrogate a creature. I was here because humanity was finally being called to account, and the witness had come down from the mountains to deliver testimony about sins we'd long forgotten we'd committed. I moved toward the table with legs that felt borrowed from someone else's body, each step an act of will against every instinct that screamed this was wrong, impossible, a violation of natural law. The creature tracked my movement with those devastating eyes, not with the blank stare of an animal assessing threat, but with the measured attention of someone who had been expecting me, who had perhaps been waiting years for this exact moment when the walls between our worlds would finally thin enough for truth to pass through. Its breathing was deep and controlled, the rise and fall of that massive chest somehow more human than the rhythm should have been, and I realized with a jolt that it was managing its own fear, controlling its response to captivity and confinement with a discipline that spoke of profound self-awareness. The fur that covered its body was not uniform, but varied in texture and shade, darker across the shoulders and spine, silver threading through like veins of moonlight, each strand part of a pattern that felt deliberate, adaptive, the result of centuries lived in shadow and survival. As I lowered myself into the chair across from it, I caught a scent that was earth and moss and something indefinably ancient. The smell of deep forest floors where sunlight never reaches, where life follows rhythms older than human memory. The translator they'd given me sat awkwardly in my hands, but before I could activate it, the creature moved, lifting one enormous hand with startling gentleness and placing it flat against the table, palm down, fingers spread in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of peace, of initiation, of invitation to witness. My training told me to establish authority, to control the interrogation space, to make it clear that I held power in this exchange. But those protocols crumbled in the presence of something that had walked the earth when my ancestors were learning to make fire. I activated the tablet, and the screen glowed between us, displaying the symbols Dr. Chen had programmed. Crude approximations of meaning that felt insultingly simple for the intelligence I faced. The creature regarded the device without surprise, as if technology itself was just another temporary human obsession it had observed from the margins of our world. Then slowly, deliberately, it began to move its free hand through the air, tracing shapes that my tablet struggled to interpret, patterns that combined gesture with expression, with sounds that rumbled from deep in its chest, a language that was more than verbal, more than physical, something that engaged every sense simultaneously. The translation that appeared on the screen was fragmentary, incomplete, words like witness and remember and before, strung together in ways that suggested vast concepts compressed into symbols, never meant to hold such weight. I found myself leaning forward, straining not just to understand the words, but to grasp the consciousness behind them, to bridge a gap so fundamental it made the space between languages seem trivial. When the creature's eyes met mine again, I saw something flicker in those depths, not hostility or resentment at being caged, but something closer to compassion, as if it pitied me for the limitations of my understanding, for the poverty of a worldview that had no room for its existence, for all the truths my culture had chosen to forget in its rush toward concrete and steel and dominion. The next symbol it traced was more complex, and the tablet's translation came haltingly, offering words like guardian and balance and sacred contract, concepts that felt pulled from mythology rather than any reality I recognized. But as the creature continued, building meaning through repetition and elaboration, a picture began to emerge that was both beautiful and devastating, a history written in gestures and sounds that predated written language, predated perhaps language itself. Its kind had walked these forests when the trees themselves were young. It conveyed, not as rulers but as shepherds, maintaining connections between things humans had learned to see as separate: earth and sky, predator and prey, growth and decay, the visible and the invisible. They had been witnesses to an order so profound, so intricately balanced, that human civilization, with all its achievements, looked like a child's tantrum in comparison, destructive and heedless and catastrophically brief. The creature's hands moved with increasing urgency now, and I realized it was not just communicating facts, but sharing grief, a sorrow so deep and ancient it seemed to fill the reinforced room like floodwater, rising around us until I could barely breathe. Through the symbols and sounds, through the expression that crossed features too human to dismiss as animal, too alien to fully comprehend, I understood that I was not looking at a primitive, evolutionary dead end, but at something that had chosen the margins, had retreated into myth and shadow, not from weakness but from a kind of wisdom, withdrawing from a species that had forgotten how to listen, how to honor, how to coexist with the sacred machinery of the living world. Then it did something that shattered the last of my professional detachment, reaching across the table with impossible speed yet perfect control, stopping its hand just inches from mine, palm up this time, an offering rather than a threat. The gesture was so clearly an invitation that I responded before thought could intervene, extending my own hand until our fingers were almost touching, separated. By a space so small it felt symbolic, the gap between worlds held in the fraction of an inch. The creature's eyes held mine with an intensity that was almost unbearable, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was the real moment of first contact, that everything before had been preamble, and that what it wanted to share could not be reduced to symbols on a screen or translated into the poverty of human language. It wanted me to understand, not with my mind, but with something deeper, some faculty of knowing that my culture had bred out or suppressed or simply lost in the noise of its own cleverness. The air between us seemed to thicken, to hum with potential, and I felt myself on the edge of something immense, a revelation that would either expand my understanding of reality or shatter it completely. And in that suspended moment, with cameras recording and scientists watching, and the full weight of institutional authority pressed against the walls around us, I had to choose whether to bridge that final distance, to touch the impossible and let it touch me back, to become something more than an investigator and accept the role it had been waiting to assign me. Not interrogator, not captor, but student, witness, and perhaps, if I proved worthy, messenger for truths the modern world desperately needed, but had long ago stopped believing it could hear. I closed. That final distance, my fingertips meeting the creature's palm, and the world I knew ended in an instant, replaced by something so vast and alien, it felt like falling upward into a sky with no ceiling. The contact was not physical in any conventional sense. Yes, I felt the texture of skin rougher than leather but warm with life. Yes, I registered the size of that hand that could have crushed mine without effort, but these sensations were immediately overwhelmed by something else, a rush of images and feelings and knowings that bypassed language entirely and poured directly into some deep reservoir of consciousness I had never accessed before. I saw forests, but not as I had ever seen them, not as collections of individual trees and plants and animals, but as a single breathing organism, a network of connections so intricate that every root and wing and heartbeat was a note in a symphony of staggering complexity. The creature was showing me memory, but not in the way humans remember, not as discrete events filed chronologically, but as layered experiences that existed simultaneously, centuries compressed into moments, moments expanded into epochs, time itself revealing a fluid quality that my linear mind struggled to process. I saw the world when ice still gripped the northern reaches, watched glaciers retreat and valleys fill with life, witnessed the slow, patient emergence of forests that would stand for thousands of years. And through it all, moving in the margins, never numerous but always present, I saw them, the creatures, the guardians, the ones who had learned to walk upright, not from evolutionary accident, but from purpose, from a role that required hands capable of mending and eyes positioned to watch horizons. They were not solitary, as the legend suggested, but neither were they tribal in human terms, existing instead in a loose network of individuals connected by something my mind interpreted as song, but was more fundamental than sound. A resonance that linked them across vast distances, allowing coordination without words, understanding without explanation. The visions shifted, and I experienced seasons not as four movements, but as hundreds of subtle transitions, each with its own character and requirement, its own role in the grand maintenance these beings had undertaken. I felt through the creature's memory what it meant to stand in a grove of ancient cedars and sense the fungal networks beneath the soil, struggling with some imbalance, to know without being told that intervention was required, to spend days carefully redistributing deadfall and modifying drainage patterns until the flow of nutrients corrected itself, and the trees' distress signals faded into the background hum of healthy forest communication. I witnessed acts of guardianship so subtle they would be invisible to human observation. A boulder shifted to redirect spring flooding, a beaver dam carefully modified to preserve both wetland and meadow, predator populations nudged through strategic intervention to prevent the cascade failures that human ecologists would not understand for centuries. This was not dominion or control, but something closer to gardening on a continental scale, practiced by beings whose lifespan allowed them to perceive consequences that would unfold over generations, whose intelligence had evolved not toward tool-making and abstraction, but toward deep pattern recognition and systemic thinking. And woven through these memories was an emotion I could only interpret as love, not sentimental or possessive, but profound and abiding, the kind of love that expresses itself through service and patience and the willingness to remain unknown, unrewarded, working in shadow and silence because the work itself was sacred, was purpose, was the reason for existing at all. Then the memories darkened, and I felt the creature's grief like a physical weight pressing against my chest, making each breath an effort as it showed me the arrival of my own kind, in numbers that turned presence into plague. I saw through its eyes the first settlements that seemed harmless enough, scattered clearings and simple structures that the forest could absorb, that might even have been integrated into the balance with time and wisdom. But wisdom did not come. And time brought only acceleration, a spreading stain of human habitation that consumed forest and meadow and wetland, with a hunger that seemed divorced from actual need, driven by impulses the creature could observe, but never fully comprehend. Accumulation for its own sake, transformation of living system into dead commodity, a fundamental severing of the bonds between people and place that left both diminished. It showed me moments of intervention attempted, times when its kind had tried to slow the destruction through subtle means, tools that went missing, paths that led travelers in circles away from sacred groves, hunters who returned from the forest with memories of strange encounters that left them reluctant to return. But these were drops against a flood, and as the centuries compressed in the vision I was receiving, I watched the guardians themselves dwindle, not from disease or violence, but from something more insidious, a kind of spiritual exhaustion born from witnessing everything they had protected for millennia, dismantled in what must have seemed to them like an eye blink, a catastrophic instant of chainsaws and bulldozers and dams that turned living rivers into dead reservoirs. The creature showed me the last gathering of its kind that it had attended decades ago by human reckoning, But yesterday, in its own perception, a meeting in a mountain sanctuary humans had not yet discovered, where perhaps 20 of them had stood in a circle and acknowledged through their resonant communion that their time as guardians was ending, that the world was changing too quickly and too completely for their ancient methods to matter anymore. The vision began to fade, and I felt myself being drawn back into my own body, into the fluorescent-lit interrogation room, and the chair beneath me, and the weight of my own limitations. But I was not the same person who had reached across that table. The creature released my hand with the same gentleness it had shown throughout, but its eyes held mine with an intensity that communicated what the visions had prepared me to understand, that I had not been shown these things for my own enlightenment or to satisfy my curiosity, but because I had been chosen, selected through criteria I could not fathom, to receive a testimony, to become a bearer of witness for truths that desperately needed speaking. My face was wet, and I realized I had been crying without awareness, tears streaming unchecked as my body processed what my mind was still struggling to integrate. Grief and awe and shame tangled together into an emotion too complex for naming. The creature made a sound then, low and resonant, and though the tablet offered no translation, I understood it perfectly. A question wrapped in compassion, asking without words whether I was strong enough for what would come next, whether the foundation it had laid could bear the weight of the revelation it still needed to share, the warning that had brought it down from the high country and into the hands of those who saw it only as specimen, as proof, as one more piece of the natural world to catalogue and control and ultimately consume. I nodded without thinking, a reflexive human gesture that felt absurdly inadequate in the moment, but the creature responded with what I can only describe as acknowledgement, a slight inclination of its massive head that suggested our two species were not so different in the grammar of meaning, that some signals transcended the boundaries of origin and evolution. It straightened in its chair, the reinforced steel frame creaking under the redistribution of weight, and began a new series of gestures, but these were different from before, more deliberate, almost ceremonial in their precision. The translator worked frantically with the tablet, but I found I no longer needed the words appearing on the screen. Something in that vision we had shared had attuned me to the creature's communication in a way that bypassed language entirely, allowing me to grasp intention and emotion even as the specifics remained slightly out of focus. The gestures formed patterns in the air between us, and I understood it was describing its kind's purpose with a clarity it had not yet attempted, trusting now that I had the context to truly comprehend what guardianship had meant, what had been lost when humanity forgot there were other forms of intelligence sharing this world, other ways of knowing that were no less valid for being unrecognized. The creature's hands moved in sweeping arcs that somehow conveyed the passage of seasons, the turning of years into decades, into centuries. And within those movements, I perceived the endless patience required of a guardian, the willingness to work in cycles that no human lifetime could encompass. It touched its chest, then extended both palms outward in a gesture that needed no translation, offering, giving, nurturing. And I understood it was describing the fundamental relationship its kind had maintained with the forests, not as owners or even caretakers in the human sense, but as partners in an ancient covenant where service flowed in both directions. The forest provided shelter and sustenance, and in return the guardians provided something I can only call conscious attention, the application of intelligence and foresight to preserve balances that would otherwise tip toward chaos or collapse. Through gestures and the strange resonance that now seemed to hum in the air between us, it showed me how they had learned to read the forest's needs through signs invisible to human perception, the quality of birdsong that indicated healthy insect populations, the scent of soil that revealed fungal vitality, the pattern of deer movement that spoke to predator dynamics, and forage abundance. This was not mysticism, but deep empirical knowledge accumulated over lifetimes that stretched beyond human comprehension, pattern recognition honed to an art form that made our most sophisticated ecological models look like children's drawings, crude approximations of systems we barely understood. The creature paused, and its expression shifted into something I recognized despite the alien architecture of its features: sorrow, profound and penetrating, the kind of grief that comes not from sudden loss, but from watching something precious die by degrees, unable to stop the process or even make the death visible to those causing it. It gestured again, and this time I saw, in my mind's eye, not the ancient forests of its early memories, but the fragmented remnants that remained, isolated patches of old growth surrounded by clear-cut wastelands and second-growth timber farms that bore the same relationship to real forest that a parking lot bears to a meadow, superficially similar in the presence of vegetation, utterly different in function and spirit. The creature showed me through gesture and transmitted feeling how its kind had tried to adapt, to continue their guardianship in an increasingly hostile and diminished landscape, protecting smaller territories with the same devotion they had once applied to entire mountain ranges. But the work had become not preservation but triage, not nurturing but damage control, each year bringing new incursions and violations that left less to protect and fewer of them remaining to do the protecting. I felt through our connection the weight of watching sacred groves fall to chainsaws, of finding streams poisoned by runoff, of tracking the disappearance of species. That had been part of the forest's fabric for millennia, each loss a wound that never fully healed, accumulating into a burden that would have broken a spirit less committed to its purpose. Yet even in this testament of loss, I sensed something else beneath the grief. Not hope exactly, but determination, a refusal to abandon the covenant even as the other party had forgotten it ever existed, even as the work became thankless and invisible and ultimately futile against the scale of destruction being wrought. The creature placed one massive hand flat on the table between us, fingers spread, and held my gaze with an intensity that made the air feel thick, charged with importance I could feel, but not yet name. It was showing me that its kind had not given up, that even now, reduced to scattered individuals haunting the deepest wilderness, they continued the work of guardianship because the work itself was sacred, because someone had to remember what the forests had been and could be again, because to abandon the covenant would be to lose not just purpose, but identity, the very core of what made them who and what they were. And in that moment, feeling the weight of its commitment and the depth of its loss, I understood that I was being offered something precious and terrible, not just knowledge, but responsibility, the burden of bearing witness to a truth that would demand I make choices I was not prepared to make, that would require me to decide where my loyalty ultimately resided. The creature's hand remained pressed against the table, and I felt the temperature in the room shift, not physically, but in some other way I had no vocabulary to describe, as though the atmosphere itself had become attentive, waiting. Its eyes, those impossibly human eyes set in that face of living myth, darkened with something beyond sorrow, something closer to dread, and I knew before it began the next series of gestures that we were approaching the true reason for this encounter, the revelation that all the previous sharing had been building toward. The translator's fingers hesitated over the tablet as the creature's movements became slower, weighted with reluctance, and I realized it was afraid, not of me or the armed guards beyond the reinforced door, but of what it was about to communicate, of making real through language, something it perhaps hoped might remain unspoken. The gestures came in fragments, disjointed, sequences that the translator struggled to interpret, and I saw words appear on the screen that made no immediate sense. Vanishing, taken, the spaces between, but the feeling that came with them was crystal clear. a cold, spreading dread that settled into my bones and made my service weapon feel like a child's toy, utterly inadequate against what was being described. The creature touched its chest, then made a gesture I had come to recognize as indicating its kind collectively, and then it drew a line through the air with one clawed finger. A severing motion, followed by pointing at me, at itself, at the walls around us, and I understood it was saying, not us, not them, something else. Entirely. The tablet screen filled with fragmentary translations as the creature worked to make me understand, words appearing in clusters, decades, hundreds, wilderness, never returned, and slowly the horrifying picture assembled itself in my mind like a puzzle made of nightmares and missing person reports I had read in cold case files. Stretching back years, cases that had always bothered me for their complete absence of forensic evidence, their absolute lack of the traces that violent death inevitably leaves behind. The creature gestured toward the mountains beyond the facility, its movements encompassing vast territories of wilderness, and through the connection we had established, I felt it transmitting not just information, but memory. Glimpses of scenes it had witnessed over its long existence that defied rational explanation, even now, even sitting across from a creature that should not exist. I saw through its recollection a young couple's campsite found perfectly intact, food still on the camp stove, boots still paired beside the tent, but the occupants simply gone as though they had stepped out of reality itself, leaving no footprints, no sign of struggle, no blood or torn fabric, or any of the brutal evidence that murder or animal attack invariably produces. The creature showed me an experienced hunter, discovered dead of apparent heart failure, his face locked in an expression of such primal terror that the county coroner who examined him, a man I had met, a professional who had seen every variation of human death, had taken early retirement and refused to ever speak of the case. The kind of detail buried in marginalia and unofficial conversations, but never making it into official reports. Because it suggested things that official reports had no framework to contain. The gestures intensified, and I felt the creature's frustration at the limitations of communication, its desperate need to make me comprehend the distinction it was drawing, the critical difference between its kind and whatever else stalked those mountains taking people, in ways that left no trace and no explanation. It pointed at itself, then made a clear gesture of avoidance, of moving away, of leaving humans alone, and I understood it was insisting that despite every legend and tabloid story and campfire tale, Bigfoot had never been the predator in these woods, had in fact spent centuries carefully avoiding contact with humanity precisely to prevent the kind of persecution and captivity it now endured. The tablet displayed the translator's latest interpretation. We hide from you, they hunt you. Always they have hunted, but we kept them sleeping, kept the boundaries strong. Now the boundaries break. Now they wake hungry. The creature's hands trembled as it formed these gestures, and I realized I was witnessing something I had never expected to see in this room. Vulnerability, fear not for itself, but for me, for all of us. For a species too arrogant in its dominance to recognize that it had never actually been alone at the top of the food chain, merely been protected by guardians. It had forgotten existed from predators it never knew were real. The creature leaned forward, and the restraints creaked with the strain, its massive frame radiating urgency as it began the most complex series of gestures yet, building a narrative I could feel as much as translate through the words appearing spasmodically on the screen. It was describing. The creature leaned back slightly, and I saw something shift in its demeanor, a resignation settling over its features like a shroud, as though it had made a decision to cross some threshold it could never retreat from again. Its massive chest rose and fell with a breath that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, and then it placed both hands flat on the interrogation table between us, palms down, in a gesture that felt oddly formal, almost ceremonial. The translator typed frantically as the creature's fingers moved in slow, deliberate patterns against the steel surface, and I watched the words appear on the screen with growing unease. Packed, broken, forgotten, price. The creature's eyes found mine with an intensity that made me forget the armed guards beyond the door, forget the cameras recording every moment, forget everything except the profound gravity of what it was trying to communicate. Its hands lifted from the table and moved through the air between us, tracing shapes that seemed to hover in my vision even. After the gestures completed, and I understood it was describing something ancient, something foundational that existed long before written history began, its inadequate recording of human civilization. The tablet displayed a sentence that made my throat tighten. Your ancestors knew, they remembered, they honored the agreement. You have forgotten, and forgetting has consequences. The creature gestured toward itself, then swept its arms wide to encompass territories beyond the facility walls, and through the strange connection we had established, I felt it communicating the role its kind had played across the centuries, not as animals hiding in the wilderness, but as something far more purposeful, more conscious in their relationship to the natural world. It showed me through movement and expression a vision of balance, of boundaries maintained between the human and the wild, of agreements struck in times so distant they survived only as fragments in folklore and myth, stories dismissed as superstition by a modern world that believed itself too enlightened for such primitive concerns. The gestures became more specific, describing how its kind had walked the edges between civilization and wilderness, keeping watch over thresholds that humans had once respected but gradually forgotten as cities grew and technology advanced, and the old warnings faded from cultural memory. Into quaint legend, I saw through its communication a picture of guardianship, of sacrifice, of an intelligence watching humanity's expansion with growing alarm as we pushed deeper into territories we no longer understood, breaking seals we didn't know existed, disturbing equilibriums we had lost the wisdom to recognize. The creature's hands moved in a pattern that suggested chains breaking, boundaries dissolving, containers opening, and the words on the tablet read, "We kept the darkness contained. You have torn open what should remain closed. We cannot hold it anymore." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, though I knew that was impossible in this climate-controlled facility, as the creature began describing what humanity's exploitation had awakened, what our drilling and deforestation and relentless consumption had disturbed in places that should have remained untouched. Its gestures grew more agitated, more urgent, painting pictures of something stirring in depths beneath the mountains, of presences emerging into spaces they had been barred from for generations, of the natural world's immune system failing under the assault of human activity. The translator struggled to keep pace as the creature described warning signs its kind had observed over recent decades, patterns in animal behavior and plant growth that spoke of fundamental disruptions in the order of things, of protective barriers worn thin by pollution and destruction until they could no longer hold what they were meant to contain. I thought of the missing persons cases I had investigated, the inexplicable disappearances, the cold trails that ended as though people had simply ceased to exist, and suddenly they took on a different character. Entirely, not random tragedies, but symptoms of something systemic, evidence of boundaries collapsing and consequences manifesting. The creature's eyes held mine as it formed one final gesture, pointing at me, then at the door, then making a motion that encompassed the entire facility and presumably the government apparatus beyond it. And the words appeared, "We are not your prisoners, we are your messengers, you are not listening." The full weight of what it was telling me settled into my consciousness like a stone sinking through dark water, and I realized this interrogation had never been what I thought it was from the moment I walked through that reinforced door. This creature sitting across from me restrained and studied and treated as a specimen to be catalogued and potentially dissected, represented humanity's last warning from forces we had dismissed as mythology, a final attempt at communication before something irrevocable occurred. Its kind had maintained a covenant we no longer remembered, had stood as wardens between our world and something else that existed in the spaces our maps left blank, and we had systematically destroyed their ability to continue that protection through our relentless consumption of every wild place. Our transformation of sacred forests into resources to be extracted and exploited. The creature wasn't here because we had captured it through superior tactics or technology. It was here because it had allowed itself to be found, had walked into our trap deliberately because all other methods of reaching us had failed, because humans no longer listened to the warnings written in animal behavior and weather patterns and the ancient instincts we had educated ourselves out of. Feeling. I looked at this being that should not exist according to everything my education and training had taught me, and understood it was offering something far more valuable than proof of cryptids or vindication for believers in the unexplained. It was offering one last chance to remember what we had forgotten, to acknowledge agreements our ancestors had honored, to recognize that our dominion over the earth had never been absolute, but merely permitted under conditions we had violated so completely we didn't even realize we were breaking them. The creature's hands suddenly stopped moving, hovering in the air between us as though touching something invisible, and I watched its expression shift into what I could only describe as profound sorrow mixed with ancient fear. Its fingers curled slowly, deliberately, forming shapes that made the translator pause before typing, as if the device itself was reluctant to render what came next into human language. When the words finally appeared on the screen, they carried a weight that seemed to press against my chest. The hollow ones, the empty, the first hunger. The creature's eyes reflected something I had never seen in them before. Not just caution or warning, but genuine dread, the kind of primal terror that transcends species and touches something fundamental in any consciousness capable of understanding mortality. Its gestures became more specific, describing entities that existed before its kind, before humans, before the forests grew tall, things that belonged to an older order of existence that the natural world had learned to seal away through processes we would call evolution, but which the creature communicated as something closer to collective defense. Through its movements, I understood these hollow ones were not creatures in any biological sense, but absences, vacancies in reality that consumed rather than existed, presences defined entirely by what they took rather than what they were. The tablet displayed fragments that built a terrifying picture. They do not kill, they hollow, they empty. They take what makes a thing real and leave only the shape behind. My mind raced back through the cold cases in my files, seeing them now through this impossible lens the creature was providing, and details I had dismissed or failed to connect suddenly formed a pattern that made my stomach turn. The disappearances always occurred in areas where heavy logging or mining operations had recently begun, always in wilderness zones that had remained relatively untouched for decades before corporate interests pushed into them with machinery and permits and absolute confidence in their right to extract whatever resources lay beneath the soil. The victims were found sometimes, their bodies recovered, but somehow wrong in ways the medical examiners couldn't quite articulate in their reports, described as unresponsive or absent, even when vital signs registered normal, as though something essential had been removed that no autopsy could identify or forensic analysis could measure. I remembered one report in particular, a hiker found sitting upright against a tree 3 days after she vanished, eyes open, breathing steady but completely unreachable, existing in some state between life and death that defied medical classification until her body simply stopped functioning a week later, shutting down as though it finally realized the animating force that should have inhabited it was gone. The creature watched me process these connections, and I saw recognition in its eyes, an acknowledgement that I was finally understanding what it had been trying to communicate, that the missing persons weren't random victims of wilderness accidents, but evidence of something far more systematic, predation by entities that didn't eat flesh, but consumed something more fundamental, more essential to existence itself. The creature leaned forward, and despite the restraints and the reinforced glass behind me and the armed response team beyond the door, I felt completely vulnerable as it began describing how its kind had spent centuries keeping the hollow ones contained in deep places, in caverns and rifts where the boundary between our world and whatever existed beneath was naturally thin. Its gestures painted pictures of an endless vigil, generations of its people standing watch over sites they marked as forbidden, places humans once knew to avoid through cultural prohibitions and sacred designations, territories our ancestors understood were not meant for habitation or exploration, regardless of what resources they might contain. The tablet showed words that made the hair on my neck stand up. We sang them to sleep. We kept them below. We walked the boundaries, so you would not have to know they existed. But humanity's expansion had destroyed that careful network of guardians, decimating the creature's population through habitat loss and occasional violent encounters with humans who saw only monsters to be eliminated rather than protectors maintaining an essential service. The logging operations, the mining excavations, the drilling and blasting and relentless penetration into mountain depths had cracked open. The very seals its kind had spent millennia maintaining, and now the hollow ones were emerging into a world that had forgotten they existed, encountering humans who had no defenses against something their technology couldn't detect and their weapons couldn't harm. The creature made a gesture that encompassed time, a sweeping motion that suggested acceleration and inevitability, and I understood it was telling me that disappearances would increase, that what I had investigated as isolated incidents over decades were merely the beginning of something exponentially worse. Its hands moved in patterns describing multiplication and spread, showing how each emergence of the hollow ones weakened the remaining barriers further, how each person they emptied somehow fed their ability to manifest more completely in our reality, creating a terrible cycle that would accelerate as environmental destruction continued opening new passages from the deep places into inhabited areas. The words on the screen read, "They are hungry. They have been hungry for so long, and you have set them a feast." I thought about cities built in mountain valleys, suburban developments pushing into formerly protected forests, hiking trails carved into previously inaccessible wilderness, and realized we had created a vast network of access points where vulnerable humans wandered unknowingly into territories that should have remained sealed. The creature's eyes held mine with an intensity that felt like a physical touch, and through that gaze I sensed it was showing me a future that would unfold if nothing changed. A progression where the disappearances became commonplace, where entire communities would be hollowed out, where the distinction between the living and the merely animated would blur, until humanity faced something our science had no framework to even recognize as a threat, let alone defend against. The creature's massive hand extended toward me slowly, palm up in a gesture so deliberately unthreatening that I understood immediately it was an invitation rather than a threat, and everything in my training screamed at me to step back, to maintain professional distance, to remember protocol and the dozen regulations I would violate by making physical contact with the subject. But something deeper than training recognized this as the threshold moment, the point where I could either retreat into the safety of my badge and procedures or cross into understanding that would fundamentally alter everything I believed about reality and my place within it. My hand moved before my conscious mind finished weighing the decision, reaching across the space between us, and the instant our skin made contact, the interrogation room dissolved around me, and I was standing in a forest that existed in a time before humans had language to name what they witnessed. The trees towered impossibly high, their canopy filtering light that seemed somehow purer than anything I had breathed in my entire life, and I could feel the forest breathing with me, every root and branch and leaf connected in a network of communication and mutual support that made our most advanced technology seem primitive and crude by comparison. I understood without words that I was experiencing the creature's memory, seeing through eyes that had witnessed this world when the balance between all living things operated as it was meant to, when the forests regulated climate and water and the very composition of air with an intelligence that was collective and patient and infinitely complex. I saw the creature's kind moving through these ancient groves, not as solitary monsters, but as conscious participants in the forest's health, tending to fallen trees and guiding animal migrations, and maintaining the boundaries around deep places where things that should not surface were kept contained through constant vigilance, and songs I could almost hear echoing at the edge of perception. The vision shifted, and I watched centuries collapse into moments, witnessing the arrival of humans in these lands, seeing through the creature's eyes as our ancestors were taught which areas were sacred and forbidden, how the first people understood and respected the warnings because they recognized the creatures as fellow guardians rather than threats to be eliminated. But then the vision darkened and accelerated, showing the breaking of those old agreements, the arrival of settlers who saw only resources to extract and obstacles to remove, the systematic destruction of both forest and the protectors who had maintained it for longer than human civilization had existed. The images came faster now, overwhelming in their emotional intensity, and I felt the creature's grief as its kind were hunted and driven into ever-shrinking territories, watched through its memories as logging operations, carved away the forests it had known for centuries, witnessed the moment when machinery broke through into deep caverns that should have remained sealed, and the first of the hollow ones stirred in darkness that had contained them since before mammals walked the earth. I experienced its desperation as it tried to warn humans through signs and sounds we interpreted as threats rather than desperate communication, felt its isolation as the last of its kind scattered into remote mountains. Too few now to maintain the boundaries, too diminished to repair what was being broken by human expansion that never paused to ask what consequences might follow its relentless consumption. And then the vision shifted forward, showing me not what was, but what would be if nothing changed, and I saw forests reduced to silence, the network of living communication replaced by dead timber plantations that only mimicked life without sustaining it. And through that devastated landscape, I watched the hollow ones spreading like infection, hollowing out not just individual humans, but entire communities, leaving behind populations that moved and breathed, but no longer truly existed in any meaningful sense. When the creature released my hand, I staggered backward, gasping as though I had been underwater for hours rather than seconds, and tears were streaming down my face, though I had no memory of. Beginning to cry, only overwhelming grief for everything that had been lost and everything that would be destroyed if humanity continued its present trajectory without understanding what invisible structures we were demolishing in our rush toward progress. We measured only in extraction and profit. The creature watched me with those impossibly expressive eyes, and I understood that what I had experienced was not manipulation or deception, but the pure truth of its existence, a perspective that encompassed centuries of watching and protecting, and ultimately failing to prevent the unraveling of systems that kept both our species safe from threats we had forgotten existed. My hands were shaking as I reached for the tablet, needing to ask questions I barely knew how to formulate. But the device felt absurd now, inadequate to bridge the gap between human language and the depth of knowledge this being possessed, understanding earned through lifetimes of direct experience rather than data analysis or theoretical models. I looked at the creature and saw not a subject to be studied or a threat to be contained, but a messenger delivering the most important warning humanity would ever receive. If only we were still capable of listening to voices that spoke in languages older than words. The steel door burst open with a violence that shattered the profound silence between us, and Director Holloway entered, flanked by military personnel whose hands rested on weapons they clearly had orders to use, their faces reflecting the kind of determination that comes from men following protocols designed by people who had never stood in this room and looked into eyes that held centuries of witness. "Agent Morrison, step away from the subject immediately," Holloway commanded with the clipped authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. And I saw in his expression no wonder or curiosity about what we had captured, only the cold calculation of a man already envisioning the creature dissected on an examination table, its biology reduced to data points that might offer military applications or scientific breakthroughs we could patent and monetize. Behind him came Dr. Reeves and her team, wheeling equipment I recognized from forensic autopsies, steel instruments that gleamed under fluorescent lights with a sterility that felt obscene in the presence of something so ancient and knowing. And I understood with devastating clarity that they intended to destroy the messenger, because we had long ago lost the capacity to hear messages that contradicted our assumption of dominion over every living thing we encountered. I didn't step away, couldn't move my feet, even as every survival instinct screamed that defying a direct order in this moment would end my career and possibly my freedom. But the vision I had experienced still burned behind my eyes, and I suddenly understood that some truths were more important than the professional identity I had built over 2 decades of service to institutions that claimed to protect people while remaining willfully blind to dangers that couldn't be measured in budgets or threat assessments. "Sir, you don't understand what this is," I said, hearing my voice shake with emotion I couldn't contain, desperately trying to find words adequate to convey what I had learned through that touch, that moment of connection that had revealed more about the real threats we faced than 10,000 classified briefings. "This isn't a biological specimen or a cryptozoological discovery. This is someone trying to warn us about something we've awakened, something that makes every case in my files look like a symptom of a much larger pattern we've been too blind to recognize." Holloway's expression didn't change, confirming what I already suspected, that he didn't care about warnings or patterns, only about the career-making potential of being the director who brought in definitive proof of a species science claimed didn't exist. And I saw the future branching before me in that instant, one path where I stepped aside and spent the rest of my life knowing I had failed the most important test I would ever face. "Security, remove Agent Morrison from this facility and revoke his clearance pending psychological evaluation," Holloway ordered, and I felt hands gripping my arms, pulling me toward the door while I struggled not against them, but against the futility of trying to translate an experience that existed beyond language into words that might penetrate institutional thinking that recognized only force and exploitation as valid responses to the unknown. But as they dragged me past the creature, I saw it stand fully for the first time, rising to its towering height with a dignity that made the armed men step backward involuntarily, and it looked directly at me with an expression I can only describe as gratitude mixed with profound sadness, as though thanking me for trying while acknowledging the inevitability of humanity's failure to change course before consequences became irreversible. The lights flickered then, a power surge that shouldn't have been possible in a facility with redundant systems, and in that moment of darkness, I heard a sound that was part song and part something that bypassed my ears entirely to resonate in my chest, a frequency that made the reinforced walls vibrate and the steel door in its frame begin to warp, as though the metal itself was responding to a voice that commanded elements at a molecular level. When the lights returned, 3 seconds later, The creature was gone, simply vanished from a locked room with no possible exit, leaving behind only that carved symbol on the interrogation table that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond my ability to fully comprehend, and the complete absence of any being that had occupied physical space moments before. Holloway was shouting orders, demanding explanations and initiating lockdown procedures, but I barely heard him because I understood what had happened, not through logic, but through the knowledge planted in me during that vision, the understanding that what we had imprisoned was never truly contained, because its existence operated according to laws that preceded and superseded human attempts at control. They escorted me from the facility, still in shock, and I knew my career was finished, that my testimony would be dismissed as a psychological break brought on by the stress of encountering something that shattered my rational worldview. But as they processed my departure and confiscated my credentials, I felt the weight of the symbol's meaning settling into my consciousness like a seed taking root. I was no longer an agent serving institutions, but a keeper of dangerous knowledge. Someone who had looked into ancient eyes and been chosen to carry a warning forward into a world that wouldn't want to hear it. And I accepted that burden, knowing the missing people in my cold cases were only the beginning of what would emerge from the wilderness if the balance we had broken continued to fracture beyond repair. They released me with the standard non-disclosure agreement and the implied threat that any attempt to share what I had witnessed would result in prosecution under national security statutes. But as I drove away from the facility in the grey dawn, I understood the futility of their legal instruments against a truth that was already growing inside me like something alive and unstoppable. For 3 weeks, I went through the motions of administrative leave, sitting in my apartment while review boards debated my fitness for duty, but I spent those hours researching patterns they had trained me never to connect, pulling decades of disappearance reports from wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest, and discovering correlations that made my hands shake as I plotted them on maps that revealed something like breathing, a rhythm of incidents that intensified near sites of massive deforestation, mining operations, and industrial development. The symbol the creature had carved into that table haunted my dreams, appearing in my mind with increasing clarity until I began sketching it compulsively. And through some process I couldn't explain, I gradually understood its meaning, not through translation, but through a kind of remembering, as though the knowledge had always existed in some ancestral part of my consciousness that modern life had buried beneath layers of civilization and rational thought. It was a warning and a map simultaneously, showing the locations where the barriers between our world and something older had worn dangerously thin, places where the hollow ones waited in depths we had disturbed through our extraction of resources and our fundamental disregard for systems of balance that had maintained stability for millennia before human industry declared war on natural limits. I knew they were watching me, monitoring my communications and movements to ensure compliance with the silence they had imposed, so I began traveling during those suspended weeks, driving to the remote areas marked by the symbol's internal map, and what I found in those places confirmed everything the creature had tried to convey. In a valley where a mining company had abandoned operations after workers reported disturbing sounds and equipment failures that defied mechanical explanation, I discovered trees marked with symbols similar to the one I carried in my memory, warnings carved by hands that understood what slept beneath the disturbed earth and desperately tried to communicate danger to a species that had forgotten how to read the language of the natural world. Near a national forest where 17 hikers had vanished over a span of 40 years, I stood at dusk and heard that same resonance the creature had produced, a frequency that seemed to rise from the ground itself, and I felt the presence of something vast and patient and utterly indifferent to human concepts of morality or mercy, something that had been contained by agreements we had broken through ignorance rather than malice. but with consequences that were identical, regardless of intent. I collected no evidence that would satisfy institutional standards, took no photographs that would prove anything to minds trained to dismiss what couldn't be replicated in laboratory conditions. But I gathered, understanding that settled into my bones like radiation, changing me at a fundamental level that made return to my former life impossible, even if they had offered reinstatement and apologies. The final piece came on a October evening when I returned to my apartment and found the door unlocked, though I knew with absolute certainty I had secured it, and inside on my desk lay a collection of items that couldn't have been placed there by anyone with normal access, objects that represented a kind of evidence that existed outside official channels. There were photographs, old ones in deteriorating frames, showing families of settlers from the 1800s posed before forests that no longer existed, and in the deep background of several images, I could discern shapes that the original viewers had likely dismissed as shadows or defects in early photographic processes, but which I now recognized as figures watching from the tree line, guardians bearing witness to the beginning of changes they couldn't prevent. Beside these lay a leather journal, written in a language I somehow understood despite never having studied it. Entries from a Native American elder describing the old agreements, the sacred boundaries that separated human territory from regions that belonged to older things, and the ceremonies of respect that maintained peace between worlds that were never meant to intersect beyond carefully negotiated points of contact. The final item was a modern topographical map marked with locations across North America, dozens of sites where the barriers had failed or were failing, and I understood this was not just information, but assignment, a responsibility being passed to me because the original messengers could no longer safely move through a landscape we had transformed into something hostile to their continued existence. My official termination came through email, a bureaucratic conclusion to a career that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, someone who had believed the systems and institutions were adequate to address the real threats facing humanity. And I felt only relief at the severing of that final connection to a world I could no longer serve in good conscience. I spend my days now traveling between the marked locations, documenting patterns and trying to warn communities that exist adjacent to the thinning places, speaking carefully to avoid the institutional commitment or criminal charges that would silence me, but clearly enough that those with ears to hear might recognize truth in what I'm describing and take whatever protective measures remain available. Sometimes in deep wilderness, I catch glimpses of tall figures moving through trees with a grace that seems to bend physics, and I understand they are still trying, still maintaining what vigil they can, despite everything we have destroyed. And occasionally I find signs that they know I'm carrying their message forward. Small tokens or arrangements of stones that feel like acknowledgement from allies in a struggle most people don't know exists. The career I lost and the life I surrendered feel like necessary prices for the truth I carry, and I understand now that the creature wasn't captured but chose to reveal itself, selecting me through criteria I'll never fully comprehend to be a translator between worlds. And though I cannot stop what we have set in motion, I can at least ensure that when the consequences arrive and the hollow ones emerge fully into a world that forgot how to protect itself from ancient hunger, there will be some who remember that we were warned by messengers we imprisoned and ignored because we valued dominance over wisdom and exploitation over the survival that comes only through balance. What would you do if you learned everything you believed about the wilderness was wrong? Subscribe to uncover more truths hidden in the unexplained.